Now it's time to move on to revenue options. And here to outline the issue is Commissioner of Revenue, Randy Hoffbeck. Randy was appointed commissioner by Governor Bill Walker in December. He's got 30 years of experience in tax administration, valuation, and appraisal of real estate. And the last 20 years, he's been directly involved in or has assisted the Department of Revenue and the North Slope Borough in the administration and valuation of North Slope properties. Please welcome Commissioner Randy Hoffbeck.
Thank you. When I first started working in December, and it became readily apparent that we were going to have some real fiscal issues moving forward, I started talking to the governor about revenues. And he told me it wasn't time yet. And so I've been on the bench for 6 months, and it's finally my turn to talk. So settle in. I think some of the frustration that people felt this morning, the process was difficult. Groupthink is always a hard thing to try and work through and quantify. But I think it also really points out to just how difficult this process is going to be. I mean, even people in that first group that were stakeholders and had a significant knowledge about the issues that they were dealing with still struggled with when it started to really get down into the details of just how to quantify the value of those particular services. And then it gets even more tricky when you try and put a dollar value on it. And so this is going to be a very difficult issue. And I actually, need to applaud the legislature and the governor in being able to make $800 million worth of cuts in this first year, because that's unprecedented. When we started, the governor laid out a plan early on that we would get our own house cleaned up first. That before we would ask anybody else to participate in bringing this fiscal imbalance back into balance, that we would look at our own house. We would find out what it is that we could do to streamline and deliver services more efficiently and inexpensively. We knew that when we laid our first set of cuts on the table, that the legislature would make additional cuts, and they did. And they held the public hearings, and they worked through some very difficult issues, and they're at a little bit of an impasse on the last of those issues. But to get to where we've gotten so far in 6 months is pretty remarkable. But now it's time that we talk about the other side of the coin and start talking a little bit about revenues. I heard several people talk about fiscal crisis. The reality is we don't really have a fiscal crisis. I think the governor expressed it well in his state of the budget message, that this is a challenging time, that this is a time that's going to be difficult, but it's a time of opportunities. It's a time where we can really kind of reshape the government within the state of Alaska and what people expect to be delivered in services and what we can deliver. And the reality is that it's only going to become a crisis if we don't act. We have the benefit of large savings. And we have the benefit of being able to work through this process in a systematic fashion to get to an answer. But we do have to act, and if we fail to act, we take a challenge and we turn it into a crisis. One of my favorite quotes is from Teddy Roosevelt, that he delivered in Paris, France in 1910, and from his speech, Citizen in a Republic. Where he says, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or whether the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither knew victory nor defeat." I think that's a mantra for what we have right now, in that this is no time to be timid. I heard somebody say that when one of the presenters talked about this isn't a time to be timid, and that's exactly it. This is no time to be timid. This is a time where we need leadership, we need to step up. The discussions are going to be incredibly difficult, but the discussions need to be had. And the decisions are going to be even more difficult, but the decisions need to be made. And this group that's here today is the group that we're hoping will take the message out. Certainly, the governor and his staff will take the message out. The legislature will do their process to take the message out. But we're also hoping that this group here will also take the message out and really start talking about some of these solutions that nobody's there to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about them, and we need to start talking about them. I told my wife that I said, if I do my job this summer, by this fall, I could be the most hated man in the state of Alaska. And she said, I'll still love you, but don't take my dividend. So to start this discussion on revenues, I think I need to debunk a couple of myths first. One that I heard a couple of people talking about, and also actually read it on a few of the blogs that are at the bottom of the articles, which are, you really shouldn't read those things. But it said that this was all a setup, that this was all being made up so that we could implement an income tax or to take the permanent funds so that we could continue to increase the size of government. That is just simply not true. The last thing in the world we would do is this, if we had a choice of something to do. This is real. This is real, and it needs to be worked on. So the first of the myths that I want to talk about is this idea that we can cut our way out of our problem. And these graphs have been up here. Gunnar had something similar to it last night. Pat briefly went through one this morning. But it really is kind of this comparing ourselves to ourselves as far as our budget expenditures. And this first one just kind of shows, if you just look at the budget in nominal dollars, how much have we grown over time? And it looks like government has grown dramatically. But as Gunnar talked about, and David Thiel talked about in his presentation, and Pat talked about, if you actually adjust that for inflation, you see that our expenditures now are not that much different than they were in the go-go days of right after the pipeline boom. But if you make that one further adjustment and look at our spending per person, because obviously the more people you have, the greater your demand on government services, your higher your spending. You make that one last adjustment, and you find that our spending now is lower than it's been at any time since the mid-2000s. And if you actually this doesn't show the cuts going into next year, and if you add those in, we're down around the area that we were in 2006, and we're at almost record or historic lows for spending per capita statewide. We're definitely down in the area of the mid-2000s and close to where it was before the pipeline boom. So that I think it's critical to understand that when people say that government is bloated. But let's look at the other chart that Pat put up, and that's really if we've compared ourselves against ourselves, what if we compare ourselves against other states? And I think you find a similar result, that Alaska, although we're above that line slightly, that median line, the regression line, that's not unexpected because of the cost of delivery of service in a state like Alaska. And if you actually put numbers to that, it brackets us somewhere between, I believe Pat said this morning, $5.2 and $4.8 billion in expenditures. And we're sitting right now at right in the neighborhood of $5 billion. So we're right in the right range also, as well as compared to other states. But I want to take one other look at this. And I think if you want to put a silver lining into a dark cloud of the difficulty the legislature is having from trying to close out the end of the session, when they delivered an underfunded budget and the governor was forced to make the cuts to make that a balanced budget, we got a dramatic demonstration of what a balanced budget looks like with current revenues. We get life, health, and safety. We get essentially support for life, health, and safety. The computer technology, payroll, things like that still have to be online. And little more than that. That's what we get for $2 billion. That's a balanced budget right now. And that's missing. That's missing education. The schools don't open with that budget. We're short $1 billion for education in that budget. We're only funding half of health and social services. We need another $550 million to fully fund that. We don't make a contribution to the public retirement system with that $2 billion budget. There's another $250 million. And we haven't paid any oil and gas tax credits, and we have $700 million worth of tax credit liabilities. You add those up, you've got $2.5 billion. So the $2 billion plus the 2.5, you're at $4.5 billion. Think about that number. We're at about a $5 billion budget right now. People are talking about wanting to do 10% more in cuts. That brings us to a $4.5 billion budget. That's what you get for $4.5 billion. You still don't have any public services. You still don't have ferries that are running. Your roads and your buildings aren't being maintained. Nobody's doing audits or collecting taxes. And you could go through each of the departments and line out what's not there. So that last set of cuts, that last bit of cutting that we can do is going to be very, very difficult. In fact, it's going to require cutting direct services. I mean, you look at these numbers, and could more money be taken out of the life, health, and safety? Possibly some money could be squeezed out of there. Could we squeeze education and health care, and could we deliver services more efficiently? And the answer is yes, we probably can. But to squeeze another $500 million out is a pretty big squeeze. And so this idea that we can even get the that additional 10% cut is a very, very difficult proposition. So I would say that the idea that we can actually cut ourselves to a balanced budget is something that just is not a reasonable expectation. The other myth I think we need to look at is that that oil will bail us out, that oil will save us one more time, like it did in the 80s and in the 90s and in the early 2000s. That we either got price or production that would bail us out. So I had my staff put this together and just plotting production across the top and price down the side. The red is where we're still underwater in the budget. The pink is where we're close to being balanced. The green is where we're just slightly balanced, or the light green, and then the dark green is where we're getting into more of a solid financial fiscal territory. And you can see by looking at that there's really no plausible way that oil and gas revenue is going to bail us out this time. We have lower rates, we have lower production, we have lower price. And right now, if you looked at where we're at about the 500,000 barrels a day and about $60 a barrel. So the third box down on the left-hand side at $2 billion. That's about what we're generating. For us to balance the budget with current production, we need $110 a barrel oil. And as Gunnar pointed that out last night, that is just not in anybody's forecast at that period, at this point in time. And if we were to balance the budget at $60 a barrel, I don't even know how far out you'd have to go for that to occur. We're barely more than 60% of the way, or 3/4 of the way there. No, 60% of the way there, even when we get out to 800,000 barrels a day. And certainly nobody has projections of that type of oil production anywhere in the future. So I think the expectation that somehow oil is going to bail us out is also one that we just have to say is false. We aren't going to get bailed out this time by oil, which means we have to make the decisions on how to balance the budget. Just shortly, we're going to put our revenue forecasting model up that my staff developed, and I just have to give them just more kudos than I can possibly imagine for the work that they have done on this model. There's really three things. This presentation today, the model, and a white paper that was put out yesterday. It's about 27 pages, 29-page white paper that really starts the discussion on a lot of potential revenue options, all kind of fit together as a single presentation. And I just applaud my staff for the work that they did in putting it together. The model itself, I've had several people that have looked at the model, and they said, well, can you get it to model multiple levels of progressivity? And the answer is we could. we didn't. Or they'll say, can you get it to model this interaction between this tax or this other social response to it? The reality is that what this model was built to do is to give a visual representation with accurate information below what it's going to take to close the fiscal gap. It'll help in selecting which items will be the most powerful in closing the gap. It'll help in the discussion of which ones do we want to take on, and what political capital are we going to use up in getting certain items passed. But if a certain path is chosen, this isn't the model that's going to walk us all the way there. There's going to be a much more detailed modeling behind those processes at that time. But this is an accurate reflection. It's backed up by a substantial number of tables and formulas that I think there's like 30 tabs behind which you actually can see in the model where all the calculations are occurring. And so with that, if we could put the model up so we can play with it a little bit interactively, and you could kind of see how the model works. And after we do that, then we'll go back and we'll actually talk about a few of the revenues that are embedded within the model, and some of the kind of put some values to some of those revenues. I think that we had a cheat sheet on revenues. Is that around someplace that we were going to hand out at this point in time, just so you've got them? It'll be a document you'll be using tomorrow in your groups, and I'd love to have you look at them tonight and kind of get an idea for how much you can generate from certain revenues, and so you have an idea when you walk into the room of maybe a few selections that you would like to see used during that interactive process tomorrow. But for today, we'll pass out those so you'll have them, and we're just going to kind of demonstrate a little bit here on how the model works. First thing we want to do is to set the official forecast to $70 a barrel. I'm going to, actually, after Gunnar talked last night, I thought, Gunnar got it wrong. He was way too optimistic. And because we actually run out about a year earlier than what Gunnar was explaining in his forecast at the $70 a barrel. I think $70 is a reasonable place to set the estimate for purposes of trying to balance the budget. I think most people are talking $60 to $80 a barrel is a reasonable range going forward, at least in the near term. And so I think 70 is probably the place to really look at that. So if you look at that split up there, you can kind of, if you're looking at the model right now, the top three charts up there, or graphs, the one on the left is the SBR-CBR fund balance. SBR actually will be gone at the end of this fiscal year, so it'll just be CBR, our Constitutional Budget Reserve. And you can see how quickly that spends down if we do nothing. It's spent out, the table will tell you it spends out in 2019, but it's actually there's very little left in 2018 and just enough to trickle into 2019 if we do nothing. The center graph represents, the top red line is expenditures. The blue line in the middle is revenues. And then the bars at the bottom tells you just what the fiscal gap is. Rather than having to try and figure out how much distance is between the two lines, that just gives you a graphic representation of what the deficit is. And you'll see that it's a deficit that grows over time. One of the reasons that it grows over time is shrinking production. The other is that embedded in this model is actually that government will grow in size by the price of inflation. That in fact you can't lock government down forever at zero growth without that actually accounting for substantial cuts over time. The model could actually be set to zero. Can we set it to zero? I think that's disabled on it right now. Yeah, it is, okay. But the model could be set to zero as well, and just assume flat government over the period of time as well. Then on the right is the permanent fund balance. So you can see the blue line is the corpus of the fund, and then the red line down below is the permanent fund earnings reserve. And the permanent fund earnings reserve is that portion of the fund that's actually available for appropriation and expenditure. And you see that that also spends out by about 2020, 2021, if we do nothing. And the assumption on this model is that we will spend our savings in the CBR first, and then when the CBR runs out, we will have no options but to spend the permanent fund earnings. So the status quo just makes that assumption, that we wouldn't just stop paying bills, that we would then start spending the earnings. Obviously, that's a decision that would have to be made by the legislature, but that's the underlying assumption within the model. Down the middle of the model is a set of tables that will actually show you how much the cuts that have been made and additional revenues that have been generated by the choices that you make. Then underneath that is a chart of the permanent fund dividend estimate on what that would be under various scenarios. And below that, then the yearly budget and revenue adjustments. It actually gives it gives you a table, but also underneath will tell you what your revenue and budget adjustments are numerically. And then below that, there's a color key. And if you are successful in balancing the budget, and you run out of some of your money, but not all of your money before 2030, that table will turn yellow at the top. And if you're actually successful enough that you still have money left over in 2030, it'll turn green. So, you'll know when you get there. And then below that is just tells you when the various funds run out of money, if under various revenue scenarios. So those are just some tools to help you kind of track how well you're doing. Going back up then and over on the right-hand side is where we can enter cuts. And we actually have gone in, and based on the work that you have done, that you did this morning, we've entered in numerically about what we believe the value of the cuts that could be made based on the values, the overall values that you've put on certain aspects of government. And there was actually upward pressure in some of the departments for actually increasing spending. We artificially limited those to zero and did not increase spending anywhere. We just simply dealt with the cut side of the equation. And you were successful this morning in your exercise in cutting $20 million out of the budget. And I think that really tells you just how hard this is going to be. People value the services that government offers. And they've been delivered for a long time at very little cost. And the idea of switching to paying for those is going to be difficult. But I think it's even more difficult for people to actually think about living without them. And so we're going to talk heavily on revenues. We're going to continue to work the cut side. But I think the focus, at least for me going forward, is going to be how to fund government in the fashion that people would like it to be. There's the cuts. If you'd actually, it could go down on the school or on the funding, go down to the years, because it's by departments, and then here we can make cuts in years. Put a 10% cut in for 2017, just so we can. That looks, neither one of us could actually read it from where we're at. That's roughly about right. So you'll see that even at 10% cut, if we were able to cut down to that $4.5 billion, how little that closes the gap in our fiscal situation. The dashed line above is the shadow of where we started, and the red line is where we've gotten to. So you see that. That even that level of a cut doesn't get us even close to balancing the budget. So let's play a little bit with some of the budget cuts. I'm going to have to step over here so I can see. On the revenue options, let's go in and set the permanent fund to an endowment model. It's been called POMV by others, but it's essentially an endowment way of managing that. Set it to can you set it to 4% or 4.5%, which would be similar to what Representative Hawker's bill indicates, and then set it to 50%, or you could just do the share that would go to state government. So it's one past the bottom. David told me that he actually can't read the numbers from where he's at, so he's doing the best he can. Okay, so now you can see on the blue line that if you actually went to an endowment methodology for managing the permanent fund, and limited the and then used 50% for funding government, 50% for permanent fund dividends, that you can start to close the gap. But you're still $2 billion short next year, and about $1.5 billion the year after that, and then it starts to grow again. So it won't close it, but it gets you, it's one of the steps you could take. Let's scroll down. There's been some talk about using, collateralizing the state finances as a method for our state assets as a way to fund government, essentially borrowing against our assets, investing with the hopes that you get a greater return on the investments than what it cost you to borrow, and over time that would grow the value of the fund and would generate additional revenue. So go ahead and implement the investment. And you'll see that moves it a little bit. But I think there were some people after talking about it thought that was the magic bullet that would get us there. It gets us about $300 million a year when it's fully implemented, if everything goes well. And that's a big if. This is really a very risky time in the market for investing. You can borrow money for nothing right now. But there's a lot of money chasing the good investments, and the good investments are priced high. And if you get a market correction, you take a lot of risk by using that type of a methodology for generating revenue. But over time, it should generate revenue, but there'll be some years where it'll be positive, some years that'll be negative. Over time, it should generate revenue, but it's not the panacea. It's not the ultimate way to get there. Let's scroll down a little bit further. And let's change, come back up a little bit. Since we're in a low oil price environment, let's raise the minimum tax from 4% to 10%. There you go. And then, so you see there, that changes it as well. And you get a little bit of a bump early on, again, it brings it closer, but that doesn't get you all the way there either. Scroll down and let's do everybody's favorite, and let's do income tax. Let's do the income tax, add it, and then set it at 15% of the federal liability, which would be similar to Representative Seaton's bill. And then let's add in the capital gains tax at 10% as well. Okay, now you can see you're starting to get close. You haven't turned yellow or green yet, but you're starting to get close. But this is the process that we're going to ask you to go through tomorrow. And there's actually 30 options in there, and some of those options have multiple selections you can make within the option in order to bear down even a little bit further. But we're going to ask you tomorrow to sit down with your group in a room, working with your facilitator and a modeler from my staff, and just walk through and start selecting options until you find a set of options that could get you to a balanced budget, or until you give up. The answer is you can get there. You can get there, particularly if you recognize that the CBR and the permanent fund earnings, those are viable assets to use in balancing the budget until such time as we could get to a gas line. And let's scroll down. We aren't going to do the gas line tomorrow as far as an option, but scroll down and just punch the button on to implement the gas line. Should be the first one there. You see with that ultimately, if we can, when we get to a gas line, it will give us a revenue stream that will make us fiscally sound as well. But it's going to take expenditures to get there. It's going to cost money to get there for the state's investment. And on this one, because you've added a lot of other assets, you kind of bottom out right before the gas line comes on in your savings, but you make it to the end. If you hadn't put in an income tax and some of the others, you actually would run out of money before the pipeline came on as well. So anyway, so those are the things that you're going to play with tomorrow, and hopefully you'll be able to come up with some creative solutions. The idea here isn't that the administration has a select group that they want in play. We are not endorsing any one option or any one set of options. We really want you to work through all of them. And the 30 that you have available to work with tomorrow, obviously aren't all of the potential options. They're the ones that we've modeled. If you come up with others that you would like to have modeled, by all means, let us know. And this model will be dynamic. You know, check in every now and then on the website. It's on the website right now. And you can check, see what updates have been made to the model and what new additions there are for trying to balance the budget. Could you flip to that next tab? There's the second tab on the model, in case you lose the sheet we just passed out, actually describes every one of the cells that you could do entry in, and what it represents, and some of the assumptions behind it. So that's also on the model, so that if you're wondering about what that button really means, you can flip over to the tab, scroll down, and you can find it and what we're actually modeling with that particular item. With that, if we go back to the PowerPoint. One more page. Oh, I got it. Never mind. So this is what you're going to start with tomorrow. You're going to start with an assumption of government that will grow over time with inflation. No new programs, no new services, just simply the fact that services will get more expensive over time. And with $70 oil and with gradually falling production. That's where you're going to start tomorrow with your project. I'm just going to kind of go through some of the categories that you'll be dealing with tomorrow. The first one is the repurposing financial assets. We modeled a couple of those already. We didn't model pension obligation bonds. That's something that's come up as a potential way to defray some of the costs of the retirement funds. Very similar to leveraging the assets, the collateralization. The same type of issues that timing's everything. And if we had done it 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it would have been a very, very good, robust revenue stream for us. But if we'd done it in 2007, going into 2008, we would not have liked the results anymore very much. So timing is everything on something like that. But pension obligations bonds are an option. They've been mentioned before, and we certainly are doing the due diligence on that, working with our financial advisors, whether that makes sense at all moving forward. The permanent fund earnings, you can do it either two ways in the model. You can do it status quo and just spend out the earnings as needed. Or you can go to the POMV model like we had demonstrated. Or there's another model in there that's also that was proposed by Senator McGuire that actually kind of flips the use of royalties for dividends and uses the permanent fund for funding government. Those type of options are in there, and again, they're all described in the various ones, and then the collateralization and securitization. And in looking at that, I think one of the things we have to be real careful about is there's certain aspects of generating revenue that are going to generate new money for the economy, money that's not already in circulation. And certainly, spending investment earnings is one of those things. Right now, the money is invested. It's essentially shipped out of state overseas. It's being invested elsewhere. It's not being invested in the state. And so any money that we would spend from the investment earnings is actually new money in the state. It's money that's not in the economy right now. And I think that's critical to remember, because some of these options are simply going to be recirculated money. We're going to be taking, if we put an income tax in, we're taking money from one group, repurposing it in the government, and spending it elsewhere, but it really isn't new money in the economy. And one of the things I learned in one of my first classes in economics was just some basic tax theory that says if a government charges 0 in taxes, it receives 0 in revenue for funding government. And if a government taxes at 100%, it receives 0 in revenue for government, because essentially there's no incentive then to produce. So the right number is somewhere between 0 and 100. And the idea is finding that right balance. And certainly right now, a lot of our taxes are set at 0. And that creates a problem, because if there's not some kind of nexus between economic growth and the treasury in government, economic growth becomes a drag on services. If economic growth doesn't convert into some revenue for the government, it actually takes away services from others. As you get larger economy, you have more people, you have more schools that you need, you pay out more permanent fund dividends, the roads have more pressure on them, they need to be fixed, all of those kind of things that create those services. And if there's no revenue that's generated by that growth, it constrains government. And so we need to recognize that as well as we're looking forward, that taxes aren't all bad. Spoken like a revenue guy. So then another one that we could look at would be modifying oil and gas taxes. And one of the things that we want to be real careful here is that we don't want to turn this into an oil and gas tax debate. Oil and gas taxes are just one of the options. And I think, if you kind of picture it, you've kind of got the state that's been divided up into oil and gas taxes, earnings from our investments, and other taxes. And we've depended entirely on only one of those 3 legs for years to fund government. That leg has shrunk. That leg is smaller than it used to be. Government has grown to a certain size. It can only shrink so far. And so it's time for the other 2 legs to actually start to carry their burden as well. And so we have to, in any honest discussion on the state's fiscal situation, talk about oil and gas taxes. But I don't want anybody to misinterpret this as saying it's time to go after the oil companies again. Is there room to modify oil and gas taxes, to make them more efficient, to make them work better, generate more incentives for investment while still being fair? I think that's an honest and intellectual discussion that we need to have. But to simply say it's the oil company's fault that we're in this situation, I think is disingenuous. That's not an honest statement. The reason the state has the wealth that it has is because of the oil and gas industry. And so we need to appreciate that, but make sure that oil and gas partners, that they're treated as partners, that everybody's held accountable and everybody contributes what is the proper amount to be contributed. So there's several other things here. We could raise the base rate. We could raise the minimum tax. We could change the special provisions that have been put on new oil that incentivizes looking for new oil. Cook inlet production taxes could be changed. There's just kind of a unique little aspect of cook inlet production taxes that when we changed from the ELF to PPT, the cook inlet taxes were held harmless. And at that point in time, oil in cook inlet was paying 0 in severance tax. So cook inlet oil pays 0 in severance tax right now. That doesn't expire until 2022, I believe, that provision. Is that something that could be changed early? I don't know. It wouldn't generate a lot of revenue. There's not a lot of oil in cook inlet, but it's certain provisions like that I think it's worth looking into. The hazardous release surcharge. That I think was a wonderful demonstration of just how hard this process is going to be this year. We actually adjusted the hazardous release surcharge this year with the help of the legislature, and we're able to increase it by something slightly less than a penny. And it generated, I think, $7 million $7 million in new revenues. And the angst that was felt over actually having to implement that new tax was incredible. And that was for $7 million. And we're going to ask the legislature over the next few years to come up with $3 billion. It's a heavy lift. It's a really heavy lift. And that's why we have to do it together. And then one that was put on here, the natural gas reserves tax. That was something that the reserves tax is something that is part of Alaska history. We had an oil reserve tax before the pipeline came on. The provision basically was a loan against future revenues. They paid the tax to fund government before there was oil flowing. Then when it was flowing, it became a deduction against their taxes later on. And so over time, and the way it's structured in the model, it's net zero. But it could generate $800 to $1 billion in the interim if there's a gas line coming online. And there's a speaker that'll come up after me that will talk a little bit about some of the negative impacts of decisions like that as well, because certainly they can have a dampening effect on exploration and other things. And so there's a balance here. It's not all just about the numbers. All of these numbers have socioeconomic investment decisions that are behind them as well. So it's not all about which one will generate the highest number. Sometimes it's which one generates the best number. The other side of the tax issue for oil and gas, of course, is credits. It's one that's gotten a lot of publicity. There's really two types of credits. There's the reimbursable credits that are for exploration and development of fields and net operating losses for companies that don't have production. And those become reimbursable credits that the state pays directly. That's that $700 million number that you hear about. There's also the per barrel credit that the producers pay on the North Slope. And that one is actually a deduct against their tax that they pay. And it really is, although it's called a credit, is really an integral part of the tax system. So it's been called a credit, it's called a credit in the statute, but it really is just part of the base tax rate. But it's also something that, you could adjust the credit rate as an option. Then we have the idea of modifying non-oil and gas taxes, corporate income tax, mining taxes. These taxes already exist, the fisheries tax, motor fuel tax, and sin taxes. Sin taxes being alcohol, cigarettes, our new baby marijuana, that could be adjusted as well. And the reality is the last significant tax change that we had before that, the surcharge tax, was 10 years ago. And it was for cigarettes and alcohol. And there's a 10-year gap where we have not changed any other tax except for oil and gas tax. There's not a lot of appetite for changing taxes, particularly when we had robust revenue. There wasn't a lot of reason for the discussion to even come up. But the discussion is there now, and the sin taxes were the ones that were last adjusted. And if you actually look at them in your table, you'll find that we're at some pretty high rates right now. Our alcohol tax is about as high as any in the nation. Our cigarette tax, I think, is 10th highest in the nation. Our marijuana tax, I have no idea. We're somewhere between first and third. And then we can add new taxes. Healthcare provider tax. Interestingly enough, we're the only state in the nation that doesn't have a healthcare provider tax. And there's a description of that tax in the handout, but it's one that could generate a substantial amount of income, and is actually not speaking for industry, but is generally supported by industry because of the Medicaid reimbursement component of it. So, that's one that is a potential. Business license or gross receipts tax, really, that's kind of an easy to implement sales tax, where the taxpayer pays on their gross receipts rather than running a tape on every transaction from the cash register. Income tax, and we used to have an income tax. There's many flavors of income tax. It's actually one of the easier ones to implement if you implement it just as a percentage of federal income tax. It retains the progressivity within the federal tax structure. And basically you file a return that says what you paid in your federal tax, and you pay a percentage of that. There are options, and there's some issues you have to deal with in where you earn the income and stuff. So it's not totally simple, but that can be implemented easier than some of the other taxes. Capital gains tax, of course, associated with that as well. A payroll or school tax, which was a tax where your first couple paychecks that you get every year, a certain amount would be taken out. And it's essentially an employment tax. We had that in the past in Alaska as well. I think it was about $10 before. I think the proposal that's out there right now is progressive from $100 to $500 per person, per employee. Sales tax, one of everybody's favorites. And this one's interesting because I know there's a lot of people that, because so many communities within the state already have a sales tax, think of it as a local tax. But nationally, it is very much a statewide tax. And it has its pros and cons. If you've already got a high local tax and then you put a state tax on top of that, you could reach some levels that are not acceptable, maybe even get capped out. But also, having worked in rural Alaska for the last 8 years, there's a lot of smaller communities that don't have the capacity to manage a sales tax on their own and have very few ways of generating income that would love to have a sales tax where they could actually piggyback off the state's tax and just add a percentage or two of their own onto it. So it's got its pros and cons, as most of these do. And then the one on a statewide, then we also looked at statewide property tax. That would have, if the entire state was incorporated, that would be a very easy thing to do. We could just add a portion to everybody's mill rate and collect the tax. Unfortunately, a large portion of the state is unincorporated, and we just simply don't have the data on what assets actually exist out there and what they're valued at. So it could be implemented. It certainly is a possibility, but it would be one that would take some time to implement. And then the one that actually generated the most interest of all the taxes when we started this discussion is this idea of gaming and a lottery. Actually, the first phone call I got on revenues yesterday was to talk to me about Powerball. And after the reporter finished the interview, she was a little bit sheepish about it because she said of all the things we could focus on, they wanted me to focus on the Powerball. And I said, well, we smiled a little bit too, but it is kind of a sexy thing, right? It's everybody's got Powerball. There's very few states that don't, and it's easy. Powerball's easy to implement. It's really essentially like a contract to implement it. And so when most states start this type of an activity, they would start with one of these national Mega Millions or Powerball or something like that, and then eventually develop their own in-state lottery type games as well. But so the idea of gaming is out there as well, and it's something that comes up. And I've been in Alaska since 1980, and it seems to come up every few years as a way to fund government. So those are the options you'll be dealing with tomorrow. There's 30 of them, and some of them will generate a lot more income than others. But I encourage you to have some fun with that. I think the things that we can really, conclusions we can draw from the discussion, what we can draw from what happened this morning and trying to look at the cuts, and I think will even be brought home even more so tomorrow, is that there's no easy answer to balancing a $3 billion budget deficit. That's a lot of money. And so it's going to take work, and it's going to take a lot of people to really, courage is the wrong word. It's not really an issue of courage, but people are going to have the desire to make it work. And I think it's really going to take a combination of four things. It's going to take continuing restraint in our spending. I think that's a commitment the governor's made, and I think it's something that is going to be critical not only to long-term success, but for people to accept the fact that these revenue enhancements are coming. We're going to have taxes that impact individual Alaskans. We're going to have to look at changes to oil and gas taxes. And we're going to have to look at a strategic use of our legacy assets, the CBR and the permanent fund and other investments that we have. And I think it's going to take some combination of those four to get to the answer, maybe all four of them. I look forward to seeing what you model tomorrow. And with that, I will turn it back over to Brian.